did watch the game last night. And and obviously, of course I was rooting for our Wildcats. Of course, right? Is anyone out there was not rooting? Anyone? Yeah. You'd be shamed to raise your hands. I know. There was, however, a little part of me, very, very small part of me that said, if we do lose, I will be able to turn this into some kind of sermon illustration. I don't know what yet. But I can probably work with this. And, I was thinking about it in terms of we're in this series called Rebirth, and last week we talked about the death part of the rebirth cycle. So I thought, well, maybe I'll tie it to that somehow. I don't know. Thankfully, I do not have to use it as an illustration, so I'm thrilled about that. But, like I said, we are in this series called Rebirth, which is our spring series, or at least our introduction to spring. It's also a series of our conversations leading us into Easter. And again, you do not need to have any kind of experience or tradition having celebrated Easter, because really what we're just looking at is the universal themes and patterns of the Easter story. We see it really throughout the progression of Easter weekend, that Good Friday into Saturday into Easter Sunday. That tells a universal story that we see echoed in nature, in the universe, and in our own lives and human development. So today, as the second installment of this series, we're going to be talking about Saturday, because last week we talked about Good Friday and how Good Friday is a moment of loss, of death, of letting go of something ending. And we know that Sunday, in the context of this story and of this pattern, is resurrection and rebirth. So then what is Saturday exactly? Certainly it's the part of this journey that is probably the least explored. It's that experience, that moment, that space in between death and rebirth, a time of waiting, a time of not knowing, a time of uncertainty. And it can be one of the most difficult experiences and difficult times of our lives, right? It requires patience. And I am not a person of patience. My partner Olivia knows this all too well about me. I'm a very impatient person, I'm embarrassed to admit. But if we were to go to a restaurant, what happens for me is we sit down, right? We're given the menus. The server leaves to give us some time to think over what we might want to order. When I decide what I want to order, that server has 0.0025 milliseconds to then come take my order before I start getting antsy. This is my problem. It's not the server's problem. This is a me thing. The same thing happens towards the end of the meal, right? The minute that I decide that I'm full, I want to go home. I want to lay in bed immediately, right? So I decide I'm full, and then the server again has like 0.0026 seconds to come bring me the check. Again, it's a me issue. I'm working on it. I'm impatient. Sometimes even like waiting for her, I can be really impatient. If we say, hey, we're going to leave the house at 3 p.m., when 2:59 hits, I'm standing at the door jingling the keys, and this is, again, it's my issue. I don't know if there's anyone out there who you're like my, spouse, my partner does this to me and I hate it, right? So I can represent the impatient person for you today. You can put all your hate onto me in this moment. But I just want to admit that. I know we all probably have some degree of impatience. And I was thinking about impatience today as sort of the uncomfortability of being in the in-between moments, right? Can we just be in those spaces without getting antsy and uncomfortable? Because how many of us know that life has very many in-between moments, right? Both literally or metaphorically. We're going to spend a lot of time waiting at stoplights. We're going to spend a lot of time waiting in lines. I don't know if you know this, there are rooms devoted to waiting, right? So we're going to spend a lot of times in these in-between spaces. In other words, right, in the context of these conversations we've been having about Easter, we're going to spend a lot of time in the Saturdays of life between the Friday, losing the old, and Sunday where the new arrives. We're going to spend a lot of time in those Saturdays. As philosopher Charles Handy once said, it is the interval between the decay of the old and the formation of the new is a time of waiting. How many of us resonate with that, right? Being somewhere in between the old and the new in the waiting. This is what Saturday represents, right? Think about now Saturday in the context of the Easter story. However familiar you are with it or not, doesn't really matter. But basically, we know that on Good Friday, it's the part of the story where Jesus dies. And so the disciples, they have this whole teaching, this way of life they have devoted themselves to, right? And it's their purpose. They gave up everything to do this, and then all of a sudden it's all gone. It's all taken away from them, and they really have no clue what's next, what to do. It's kind of like the world's biggest now what, right? And sometimes we find ourselves in those spaces. And yet here in 2026, traditionally, this day is not just Saturday, but it's called Holy Saturday. Last week we talked about Good Friday. We said, have you ever been in a Friday that you could then label as good when you were looking back on it? And today I want to ask the same question. Can you look at your Saturdays and call them holy? Can we look at the times in our life where things are not clear, things are not solid, things are not certain, and yet we could still say that they were holy. We could still say that they were sacred. We could still recognize that love showed up for us. Love was there in our midst. Now, I want to be clear about something. If we're going to use that word holy, because it's often shows up kind of as like a religious word, and I know our religious spidey senses are like, oh, I don't like that word, holy. But when I use that word, I want to be clear, because often when we hear it, we think of like something other or something separate. So it's a word of separation. But really the root of the word holy, the Latin root, is the same root for the word wholeness. So maybe we could shift our understanding of holy as this radical wholeness, this radical sense that everything belongs. So maybe we could recognize, well, you know what? All moments are holy moments. All people are holy people. All land is holy land. And yet when we call something holy or we call something sacred, it is actually pointing to the holiness and sacredness of all things, that all things belong. So if we're going to do that, can we treat the waiting in that way? Can we lump the waiting into the wholeness of all things? And we could say that even the waiting and even the in-between, that too belongs. We all have things that we've waited for, right? What are some things that you've been anticipating, looking forward to, hoping for? Maybe a better job, maybe retirement. Maybe you're waiting for your relationship to improve. Maybe you're waiting for your health to improve. Maybe as the songs spoke to us this morning, maybe you are waiting on the world to change. Or maybe you are waiting to find what you're looking for. I know some of you out there, specifically because I know who you are and you've confided in me. I know some of you out there are waiting for pumpkin spice latte season to be back. You're waiting for, or maybe it's a different flavor. Maybe you're more of like a Christmas flavor person. But really, life is just the interval between the times when your flavors are available at Starbucks or not. And I understand that. I empathize with you. Life finds us in the waiting. Life finds us in the in-between. And the thing about the in-between is it's a lot more awkward. It's a lot more uncomfortable than we think it might be. Like, remember that time when you were in between jobs? And you think about it, right? On paper, you're like, well, I don't have to work. It's time off. Wouldn't this be great? But it was not so fun, was it? Right? Because you're uncomfortable. You're waiting for the new to show up, and you've left the old, so you're on unsure footing. I find travel could be the same way, right? Because on paper, think about it. You go on vacation, right? And the minute you stop working, you'd think, well, technically I'm on vacation, so it should be fun from here on out. But then you get to the airport and you're like, this is not fun at all. Because you're not, right, you're not where you want to be, right? But you've already left that comfort and familiarity of home. So you're stuck in between the old and the new. Mid-transformation can be quite awkward. I want to share an illustration about the awkwardness of mid-transformation. In order to do that, I need to tell a little story. When I was a kid growing up and being in elementary school, we used to have these things called scholastic book fairs. Does anyone know what these are? Okay. Did they have them in your generation? Did you all have them too? Okay. I thought I was going to have to explain this whole thing. Well, anyway, At my Scholastic book fairs, I remember waiting all month because it was like, I'd get that money and be like, oh, I can buy that cool book. And in my generation, we had this book series called Animorphs, and Animorphs were about, do anyone have kids or grandchildren who, Animorphs, Animorphs, anyone know Animorphs? Okay. Animorphs were about these kids who could transform into animals, and that would allow them to save the day. It was like Transformers, but with animals, okay? And so the cover of these books, I remember it's like burned into my memory because there would be all these books, and the cover of these books would be a kid transforming, and it would show all the steps of his transformation or her transformation into this animal. Now, I recently rediscovered Animorphs, and I looked closely, and I realized that if you pause mid-transformation, things get really weird. Quite awkward mid-transformation. Take this girl who unfortunately turns into a rat, but I think nothing's worse than that kind of in-between phase. I know, you may or may not be a fan of snakes living in Arizona, but it's this, I don't know what this is, I thought I'd do one more because, Jake doesn't do anything without kind of overkill. So, one more. And I actually thought, the bear is kind of cool. That's okay with me. But anyway, really long-winded, unnecessary detour to say the transformation and the shift and the in-between can be quite awkward and quite uncomfortable. And so today I want to just perhaps take a new perspective, change the script a little bit on this. One of my favorite words to talk about these in-between phases that gives it some spiritual depth and some meaning, it's the word liminal. Liminal space, liminal time. It's one of my favorite words because it can describe a lot of different things. It can describe a physical space. It can describe different times. It can describe different actions and activities. I think of the lobby as a liminal space, right? Because you're not yet in here and we're not doing what we're doing in here, but you've already kind of left your house or whatever you're doing. And so we kind of enter into these in-between spaces that prepare our hearts, that move us into the next thing. The liminal can be physical, like a location, the borderlands of life. Sometimes there are liminal identities, right? Where we're not necessarily this and we're not necessarily that, and we're something in between. I'd venture to say that many of us here in this room today would consider ourselves to be liminal when it comes to our spirituality, right? That if you were asked like, how do you identify or where do you kind of see yourself? You're like, well, I can't exactly say that I'm all this or I'm all that. I'm kind of a mix. I'm sort of in between. I'm hard to pin down. We find ourselves at times with our feet in different worlds, or we find ourselves in the midst of multiple stages of life at the same time. Sometimes we find that who we are in this world can almost be seen as a contradiction. But friends, what if that's not wrong? What if that's not a problem? What if that's actually essential? Because we cannot skip Saturday on the way to Sunday. So what if we're willing to fully inhabit the in-betweenness of Saturday? Richard Rohr says that faith is the willingness to live with uncertainty. Perhaps a different definition of faith than many of us were given. So the question I have is, if faith is the willingness to live with uncertainty, then what if faith means living in liminal spaces, liminal times, liminal identities? And recognizing that this doesn't have to be a passive experience. It's not simply waiting for something to happen, but that even in the waiting, even in the liminal, that there is something already beginning to happen. See, the root word for liminal is the Latin limen, which means threshold, doorway, entrance, opening. So perhaps this liminal space that you're in, right? It's not just that you're on hold, right? Now, I know that none of us like being on hold.
We're sorry. All of our representatives are still assisting other customers.
And I don't care how good the music is.
As we value your call.
No one likes being on hold. You know, like, I mean, the music might be pretty good. You might be able to kind of like hang for a couple minutes. But, you know, it gets old after a certain amount of time. And then you're kind of like, yeah, I'm done, right? No one likes to be on hold for too long. No one likes to feel like you've been forgotten. No one likes to feel like you've been dropped. And yet, what if those times where we thought maybe, I was just on hold, I was just waiting for something, actually was an opening. It actually was a doorway. It actually was an entrance to something else. See, in the context of this Easter story, the disciples have experienced the bottom dropping out from underneath them, right? It's not a Holy Saturday. In fact, Holy Saturday is also known as Low Saturday, and I'm sure that's a lot more of what it felt like in those moments. That all their hopes, all their dreams were in that tomb, right? And of course, in the context of this story, this tomb is a place of death, and then, later on, in the context of this resurrection and rebirth experience that happens, this tomb is more than just that. This tomb is a place where life was revitalized and renewed. So this tomb, it was actually a place of fertility. It was an opening. And so this is what I want to invite us into today, a perspective shift that maybe as you wait, whatever it is that you're waiting for, what if as you wait, that something is already on its way to you? Or as you wait for something to grow, what if even when you cannot see the growth, that roots are forming that you're not yet aware of? What if as you wait for transformation in the darkness, something is already forming and fermenting and we simply cannot yet perceive it? Like, let's take the example of ordering something online to your house. I don't know if you've ever done that before. Have you ever used the internet to order something to be shipped to your house? We know okay. Now, possibly you've done this via Amazon, and I know like we're not I feel like it's not kind of like good to talk about Amazon, or maybe we want to pretend like we don't use it or whatever. I don't know what I don't know. So I'm gonna use Etsy instead, right? We like Etsy, right? Etsy's a lot more handmade, a lot more creative. So let's just say that you order something via Etsy, right? And in your mind, from your experience, you order this item, then you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and then yay, it shows up. But there's a whole other set of things happening on the other side of this experience that you do not perceive, right? Like before you even ordered it, someone made it. So it was already in the process of forming before you even joined the story, at least in your own perception, right? And then you ordered it, someone packaged it up, someone shipped it, it got on a plane, it got on a car. I think a pigeon might have been involved at some point. I'm not totally sure. A lot was happening that you were not aware of. Use another example, right? Think about something like wine, right? It starts with grapes that are crushed, right? They are put into darkness, in the darkness of the barrel. They are transformed, right? And then they're bottled in their transformed state. So think about this in terms of this Friday, Saturday, Sunday progression that we've been talking about. On Friday, something is crushed, right? Our hopes, sometimes our dreams, sometimes our identities are crushed. Then in Saturday, they sit in darkness. And we have hope that on Sunday they will leave that darkness transformed. But here's what's important. It is Saturday where most of the transformation is actually occurring. It is Saturday where the fermentation occurs. It is in the darkness that is perhaps the most potent part of this whole equation. St. John of the Cross was a mystic who once said, "The dark night is not the absence of God, but the presence of transformation." I'll give one final example. You may know this, I've talked about this before, but Chinese bamboo, once planted, takes about 5 years before anything really happens, before any growth really occurs, right? At least to the human eye. And then, on the 5th year, in about 5 weeks, it grows 80 plus feet. The reality is those 5 years it wasn't that nothing was happening. It's that we couldn't see that roots were forming deep and preparing the way for what will eventually be a deep and powerful transformation, rebirth, resurrection. But a lot happens behind the scenes. What is this in your life? What is the bamboo in your life waiting to sprout forth and grow? Because sometimes we find ourselves in between the death and the rebirth. Can we recognize that there is much shifting and changing that we may not be able to yet see? And then when it does show up, it appears as though this change happens all of a sudden, but perhaps it was anything but all of a sudden. You may have heard this, this idea that there really is no such thing as overnight successes, because even when we see something as an overnight success, we don't see all the hard work that has been put in, and it simply appears that way. And I wonder, in the same vein of there being no overnight successes, I wonder if there are no overnight transformations. They may appear to be overnight, but there is so much that happened beneath the surface in the dark. There are, however, overnight oats. And I was blown away the first time I made overnight oats. I was like, it really is overnight and delicious. So, try it. But neither here nor there. I hope you take this as an encouragement that even when it feels like you're waiting, even when it feels like nothing is happening, perhaps roots are forming, perhaps something is fermenting in your life. Now, we look at the world. This world and the discord and the chaos that we experience as a collective. And I think part of what we're seeing, part of what is so painful about the world today is that we are in between what could be and what currently is. We are in between an old way of organizing ourselves as a collective, as human beings. We are in between the old arrangements that we know are not sustainable, right? Not sustainable for our planet, not sustainable for our human thriving and well-being. We're in between that and the new. A new world that could be, that we can sense, that we can feel, even as it still has yet to be fully formed. And so the question I have for us today is, what if this liminal space that we find ourselves in terms of our planet and our species, right, though it might be so unbearable, it might feel so dark and bleak, what if it is also a holy Saturday? Can we also have hope that there is so many places in our world today where people are waking up, where transformation is occurring, where roots are forming? It might be hard for us to really latch on to this today, but my hope is that we can just even entertain in our hearts for just a moment the idea that perhaps when it comes to this new world that we want to see, perhaps the rebuild is already happening. We just cannot see it yet. And so perhaps we can simply have the hope and the faith to operate as though things are shifting on our behalf, even when we are not yet aware of it. The great author Alexander Dumas once said, all human wisdom is summed up in two words: wait and hope. Friends, we need hope. I don't know about you, but we need hope in this Saturday that Sunday is still coming. We need faith, right? As Richard Rohr said, faith, that willingness and that ability to live in uncertainty. I think we need faith in this Saturday that we can still live and we can still thrive and we can still call it holy. We can still see it as a place of wholeness where everything belongs. The great songwriter Tom Petty once said, the waiting is the hardest part. You might remember that. And I think he was right. I do think he was right. But the question I also want to ask today is, what if we continue to show up in love? We continue to show up with hope and with faith. Maybe we could also see that waiting is the most essential part. A liminal waiting that invites us into a doorway and an opening. So I want to invite you to wait with me a little longer. Not a passive waiting, not a hopeless waiting, not a fruitless waiting, but a waiting that is already us moving towards an opening, towards a doorway, towards a threshold, with faith that Sunday is coming.